Yes. I will be posting these housekeeping reminders into the chat box for everyone to see once we get started with the actual conference proceedings today. So welcome back. Welcome to the second day, second panel of Social Justice Remade, the Decline of the European Welfare State in a Global Context, 1973 to 2009. My name is Matthew Sohm. I'm a doctoral candidate in history at Harvard, and I'm the co-organizer of this conference together with Giuliana. We're pleased to have you back if you were joining us yesterday, and very happy you could make it. This is your first day with us. I wanted to thank our presenters and commentators once again for their participation and ongoing commitment at this time of truly unprecedented challenges and time constraints from childcare, elder care, and the many, many other obligations that people are facing right now. We all very much appreciate your participation and the chance to continue this important and timely conversation in spite of the current travel and meeting restrictions that we're all facing. Today's panel, Recasting the European Welfare State, considers three responses to the myriad challenges confronting different European welfare states and the European welfare state more broadly in the 1970s and 80s and beyond, and showcases three diverse and exciting scholarly approaches that really illustrate the breadth of questions that this topic takes in across a wide variety of geographies and methodological approaches. Kicking off the discussion today will be Chelsea Schields, who is Assistant Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine. Her current book project, Offshore Attachments, Oil and Intimacy After Empire, explores how the age of oil and the end of empire brought renewed intervention in Caribbean intimate life. She's also the co-editor with Dagmar Herzog of the Routledge Companion to Sexuality and Colonialism, forthcoming in 2021. Laurent Warlouzet is Professor of European History at Paris Sorbonne University. In his recent book, Governing Europe in a Globalizing World, Neoliberalism and Its Alternatives Following the 1973 Oil Crisis, he interpreted the history of European integration as a contest between social-oriented, neo-mercantilist, market-oriented, and neoliberal projects, wherein competition policy played a major role in the assertion of a neoliberal Europe. Laurent Stokes is Assistant Professor of History at Northwestern University, where she teaches German history, migration history, and the history of sexuality and gender. Her first book, Fear of the Family, Guest Workers, Family Migration, and the Federal Republic of Germany, is due to come out with Oxford in fall 2021. If she ever manages to leave the United States again, she intends to continue her work on her projects on the history of airports, the history of bisexuality, and the shell wives and the making of the multinational corporation. Finally, the discussant today is the co-organizer of this conference, Giuliana Chamedes, who's Morgridge Mellon Associate Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her first book, A 20th Century Crusade, The Vatican's Battle to Remake Christian Europe, was published by Harvard in 2019. And she is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Failed Globalists, Economic Development, Decolonization, and the Demise of European Political Hegemony, 1973 to 2008. Thank you, everybody. And without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to Chelsea Schields, who will present her paper, The Science of Retrenchment, Transnational Knowledge, Race, and the Dutch Welfare State. Chelsea?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So thanks so much to Giuliana and Matt for bringing us all together and for transitioning us so seamlessly to this online format. It might not have been seamless for you, but it was definitely easy for us. So thanks for that. I'm really excited to continue our conversation from yesterday, including thinking about the history of Europe's welfare state from the outside in. So if we view Europe's welfare state from the offshore, what I dub the offshore, from these typically insular nations in the Caribbean and the Pacific and Indian Oceans that did not decolonize according to familiar models of nation-state sovereignty, we encounter a welfare state that did not necessarily rise and fall but one that was from its inception characterized by a degree of racialized abandonment, with differential spending demarcating Europe's offshore margins from its continental core. Now, that's, of course, not what anti-colonial leaders envisioned when they proposed Euro-Caribbean integration in the 40s and 50s. Rather, anti-colonial thinkers insisted that economic restitution was a fundamental part of decolonization, as we discussed yesterday. And inclusion in emerging European social security schemes was one key reason why metropolitan integration was thought to be transformative rather than reactionary. And many similar arguments proliferated in the Dutch Caribbean, which is the focus of my talk today. However, contrary to these decolonizing ambitions, the uneven expansion of social welfare has really undercut these ideals of unity, and the effects are plainly visible in the Caribbean today. With the tourist economy practically shuttered, half of Curaçao's population, that's a Dutch island in the Caribbean, half of Curaçao's population now depends on food banks for survival. That is a situation that is literally unthinkable in the European Netherlands. And though the Netherlands has agreed to provide millions in aid, they've done that with a kind of burdensome aid conditionality that would allow the Dutch parliament to retain far-reaching oversight of Caribbean economies and politics. So far, this drastic curtailment of autonomy has prevented the Caribbean islands from accepting aid and has stalled the deployment of that aid, though I should note that the Dutch did not delay in sending in the military to quell protests against austerity measures on Curaçao back in June. In a rather remarkable quote for our times, the Aruban prime minister recently wrote a letter to Mark Rutte, the Dutch prime minister, saying, quote, "It is almost as if Aruba has become the country version of the American George Floyd, and our own Mitch Enriquez," this was an Aruban teen murdered by the Dutch police in 2015. "Mark," she wrote, "we can't breathe like this." So setting aside the dangers of equivalences like that, the question does arise, why this patchy extension of the Dutch welfare state beyond Europe's continental borders? And what I have found is, at least for scholars of US welfare statism, a rather familiar rationale. Dutch administrators have repeatedly turned to the figure of the uncoupled Black mother to explain Caribbean exclusion from the European welfare regime. Though citizenship does allow people from the Caribbean to travel to the Netherlands to access the welfare state, of course, at the expense of, uprooting one's entire life. So the paper that I've shared with you all is an effort to think through how transnational knowledge on Black kinship and family life circulated to the Netherlands, largely from the United States in the 1970s. And it bridges my first book project, which looks at how ideas about sex and race shaped the end of empire and the vagaries of the oil market in the Dutch Caribbean, and a second project tentatively titled Moynihan in Europe, which considers how studies of Black kinship shaped social policies throughout the Atlantic world, but with a special focus on how knowledge traveled from the US and the colonial Caribbean to decolonization era Europe. In the Dutch case, studies of Black kinship found their way into municipal social service departments and the Ministry of Social Work starting in the 1970s. And just like in other national contexts, these studies cast so-called culturalist markers of difference as really durable pathologies that necessitated the reduction of social spending. So the narrative that I'm telling tells a very different story of the so-called Dutch miracle. This is the kind of rose-tinted narrative that the reduction of social spending in the 1980s and 90s was achieved through a remarkable degree of social consensus and was immune to racist manipulation. So if we turn to the science that informed state policy, we see a different picture. And indeed, it's really only by muting Caribbean voices that this idea of consensus emerges. So the tight relationship between social science and social policy in the Netherlands emerged at the outset of mass Caribbean movement to the Netherlands. Roughly half of the population of Suriname left after 1973, which was rather unexpected. This was when Dutch and Surinamese leaders announced that that country would become independent. And it's worth noting that in a kind of ironic twist, independence was primarily the idea of the Dutch government, in fact, the progressive labor government of Joop den Uyl, who wanted to shed that country's the Netherlands colonial image. So Antillians feared that they would also be made to accept this program of so-called forced liberation. And so thousands came in the 1970s fearing the loss of their citizenship. They managed to retain their Dutch citizenship, which became all the more valuable in the 1980s when hundreds of thousands more Antillians came to Europe following the collapse of the oil refining industries on Aruba and Curacao specifically. So all of this is occurring, of course, as the Netherlands is experiencing its own energy-related crisis. And so if it's true that consensus allowed for growing privatization and social spending cuts throughout the 80s and 90s, I'm asking what produced that consensus. One answer lies, I think, in the knowledge produced by the welfare state. This was a highly organized and well-funded enterprise that offered huge sums of money for research that was deemed relevant to policy. And for Dutch bureaucrats and social scientists, the very first task was to produce an inventory, those were their terms, an inventory of Caribbean populations that disaggregated Caribbean-born Dutch citizens from their European counterparts and indexed their use of public services. And so fairly quickly, already in the early 1970s, the consensus emerged that the welfare system, including child stipends and public housing, was not equipped to handle Caribbean family forms. So bureaucrats and social scientists that they contracted pointed to the prevalence of single motherhood, the informal adoption of non-biological children into that household, and the so-called very large family size as reasons why the welfare system was ill-equipped for Caribbean migration. So one report from the city of Amsterdam in 1973, just at the very onset of this migration, insisted that family forms created a dynamic of, quote, structural welfare dependence. So what struck me in these studies was not just the kind of echoes of Moynihan that we discussed yesterday, but also the constancy of citations. And two names that emerged more or less constantly in state-funded research were that of Melville Herskovits and E. Franklin Fraser, two US scholars that proposed divergent theories on the origins of the mother-centered family. Albeit 3 decades earlier and in a very different national context. But the utility of this old debate lay, at least for Dutch researchers, in its seemingly predictive capacity. So if matrifocality was a cultural tradition stemming from West African norms, this was Herskovits's argument, then single motherhood would continue and it would place further stress on the welfare state. However, if other theorists were correct that matrifocality was in part a response to economic hardship, then improved socioeconomic position in the Netherlands might result in more marriages and what they deemed more stable household forms. And this was the view of Fraser, at least the view of Fraser that traveled to the Netherlands. His own thought was a bit more complicated. So these frameworks very strikingly displaced prevailing consensus among researchers in the Dutch Caribbean. And on Curacao, for decades, the theory went that it was in fact elite white men who were the cause of matrifocality. So the idea was that elite white men married white women, and yet whether by consent or coercion, they often maintained reproductive relationships with women of color without marriage or cohabitation. So Harry Houtink, a Dutch sociologist who's a really prominent figure in Caribbean studies, wrote, quote, "The white man is responsible for countless matrifocal families," end quote. And this, and in his view, then
pretty easy way to attend a conference.
And in his view, Black men merely mimicked this pattern, and this was widely accepted by scholars working within the region. So the erasure of this perspective in the literature resulted, I would argue, in a kind of abstraction of colonial history that buried the intimate ties that bound the Caribbean to Europe, casting Caribbean migrants as undeserving recipients of state largesse. And it's no accident, I think, that this occurred at the very moment that Caribbean-born activists insisted on making this history visible once again in an effort to defend the welfare state and Caribbean entitlement to it. Now, the other effect of this research was that it concretized the position that cultural forms were unchanging and, like biology, immutable. So as Etienne Balibar reminds us, culture can also function like a nature. And not least because of this really tight feedback loop between social science and social policy, in 1996, a seemingly signal year for the slashing of the welfare state globally, Dutch authorities cut assistance for single parents, and in its place emerged a far more limited scheme that required proof of the active pursuit of employment, even in cases where parents had very young children in the home under the age of 5. Typically, the age was set at 16. So Amy reflected yesterday on historical memory and storytelling, and that has me thinking anew about this story of the Dutch miracle, the reduction in social spending and the implementation of workfare legislation that is touted as a successful and, more importantly, a reproducible model of retrenchment that created all the good stuff, jobs and wealth, without generating all the bad stuff like racial antipathy. And of course, the imagined foil in this story is the United States. But the framing of this story really prevents us, I think, from seeing the myriad ways that the Netherlands learned from US experts and to startlingly similar effect. And we might ask whether the histories we tell about racialization writ large, which often focus on historical specificity and contingency, likewise occlude our ability to see patterns of durability and continuity across space and time. So as this strikingly global movement for Black lives forces us to reckon with these questions, I'm also moved to ask, what if racism was not an aberration of US retrenchment, but a more itinerant feature of the intellectual revolution that cast welfare as a private matter? I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. I now turn things to our next speaker, to Laurent Warlouzet.
Okay.
He's going to give his paper on the attempt to forge a common European welfare state, 1973 to 85. Laurent.
Thank you, Matthew. Can you all hear me? Yeah, okay, great. So thanks, Matthew, and thanks to Giuliana too for this tremendous opportunity to share thoughts about the welfare state in a global context, and not only in an Atlantic one. So as you already said, Matthew, my paper deals with the attempt to forge a common European welfare state in the 1970s. That is to say, a welfare state at the level of EEC, the European Economic Community, the forerunner of the current European Union. So in other words, it was an attempt, and it is still to some extent an attempt to build a multinational welfare state. So it fits into a broader debate about the so-called failure of social Europe against neoliberalism, against the neoliberal Europe. So my own contribution to this debate is based on a recent book called Governing Europe in a Globalizing World that Matthew mentioned, which examine West European economic and social policies in the 70s and early 80s, based on archives of government, international organizations mainly, but also trade unions and business. So what I found concerning this attempt to forge a European welfare state is summarized in this paper, sorry, which makes basically two claims. In terms of substance, I argue that the European welfare state was partially implemented from the 1970s onwards, but that it was different from national welfare states, as it was mainly an addition to them rather than a substitute. It was less redistributive and more focused on the implementation of common norms. And the second claim, in terms of chronology, I argue that this European welfare state was partially developed in the 1970s, and that it faced major hurdles, but those obstacles were different from the neoliberal challenge that emerged a couple of years later in the mid-1980s. So my paper is divided into 5 points. I will put them in the chat box like Quinn did yesterday. I think it's probably more using it for conversation. So as you can see, the first section will identify the key actors, while the following 4 will each examine one of the 4 features of the welfare state. So macroeconomic coordination, redistribution, legislation protecting the weakest, and lastly, international solidarity, topic that we've already touched upon in several presentations. A brief chapter on actors. Many actors took part in those various attempts to forge a European welfare state, but they were divided. So originally, when the Treaty of Rome creating the EEC was signed in 1957, Western European social policies remained exclusively national, bar a few agreements on migration in particular. The only social provisions inserted in the European Treaty were concessions made to Italy and France, but with only limited implications. In the late 1960s, this context changed with the advent of new leaders that were more interested into promoting social Europe. For example, Willy Brandt, the new German chancellor in 1969. And we can also observe a growing interest of left-wing parties and trade unions in the EEC, in the European Economic Community. For example, the European Trade Union Confederation, so a sort of an umbrella organization of all trade unions, of most of the European trade unions at the European level, was set up in 1973. This was a notable, albeit belated move, since business actors had been organized on a European scale since the 1950s. So, and moreover, deep divisions lingered over European integration among left-wing actors. But still, there was a kind of momentum to support more social policy at the European and at the international levels from the late 1960s onwards. So now I will turn to the first area, macroeconomic policy coordination. Welfare states have an indisputable macroeconomic component, only or mainly if budgetary and monetary policies are aimed at maximizing full employment. And here I will briefly examine 3 attempts at macroeconomic coordination aimed at restoring full employment despite the economic crisis. So the last one will be the European monetary system set up in 1979. It's the most well-known, but I will probably insist more on the first 2, the 1976 project of European planning and the 1978 locomotive, so-called locomotive attempt. So let's start with this project of European planning that can seem strange today, but which was not the case in the 70s. To restart the European economy after the oil shock, some prominent left-wing actors devised an ambitious project of setting up a European planning agency. So it was unveiled in a 1976 high-level report commissioned by the EC and penned by 3 European intellectuals close to the trade unions, Jacques Delors, the French Jacques Delors, the Italian Franco Archibuigi, and the British Stuart Holland. Their aim was not to set up a kind of Soviet-style planning, of course, but to invent a new form of flexible and decentralized planning system which should take into account the new aims of social policies of the 1970s, so combating waste, the extension of health services, promoting the quality of life, and also what they call the control of meso-economic firms. So meso-economic firms, it means it's with another expression for what was called in those days transnational corporations. While this grandiose project was never seriously discussed, it nevertheless showed that all options remained open in 1976 after the first oil shock, but before the second oil shock. And in parallel, ETUC leaders met regularly with European economic communities institutions and promoted common policies such as a common reduction of working time or a concerted stimulus. Most of them failed, but the idea of a concerted stimulus was taken over by heads of government in 1978. So this was a locomotive package, the so-called locomotive package promoted by the OECD, by the EEC, and by the G7. So by the most, what was called in those days the most industrialized countries. in the Western world. So it was an attempt to organize a concerted reflationary plan, so a concerted stimulus plan, with the countries in surplus, like Germany, spending more than those in deficit, like the UK or Italy. Hence, the latter, the weakest, if you want, would benefit from the higher level of spending of the stronger. So the decision was actually taken by government in 1978 at the Bonn G7 to follow this locomotive blueprint. But then the 1979 Second Oil Shock shattered this attempt. It triggered a massive crisis and even a temporary deficit of the German balance of payment. So it definitely prevented the Germans from accepting any foreign induced reflationary policies. And that's why the only outcome in terms of macroeconomic coordination was the European monetary system in 1979, very well known attempt at ensuring a convergence mainly toward German stability-based policies. But again, the EMS was only part of the story. So third part on redistribution, I will be very brief because the European welfare state has always been rather limited in terms of redistribution because it's really lies at the core of national welfare states, of national identities. And here, in terms of redistribution, we can only talk about the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, and then about regional policy, which was set up in 1975, which was by the way, a genuine redistributive policy from rich to poor countries, from richer to the richest to the poorest region, but whose size was relatively modest until the late 1980s. Fourth part on legislation. So here, in terms of legislation, the EEC action was much more important. So we have many examples in terms of environment, for example. So you have the paper by Matthew on transnational hazardous waste. Also in terms of gender equality. And in my book, I delve more deeply into the control of multinational case study, which is very interesting because actually in the 1970s, everybody wanted to control more closely multinationals. So it was a point in the new international economic order. Even the US Carter administration took an interest in what was called industrial democracy. So there were two debates, one on the control of multinationals and one on democratizing big companies. So they merged in a debate around the so-called Vredling Directive, so a project launched in 1980, and that triggered a massive lobbying from business against this legislation. So the legislation failed in the end, but the mere fact that business organization mobilized massively against it, and this is visible in archives, showed that it was an important project, even though it eventually failed. And the last section is devoted to the international part of the welfare state, which has basically two legs. On the one hand, we can see elements of international solidarity at the EEC level, for example, with the Lomé agreement, but I can discuss it more. And on the other hand, you have, on the contrary, more protectionist policies, what I call neo-mercantilist, what I call after others, neo-mercantilist policies aimed at protecting European jobs at the expense of non-Western exporting countries, mainly in steel and in textile. So the EEC was not the only institution to implement those policies, but what was notable was that those policies were implemented both at the national and at the European level in the 1970s. And to some extent, it was part of a European welfare state. So to conclude, let me stress three ideas. First, well, a European welfare state has progressively emerged from the 1970s onwards, but it is less redistributive than the national welfare state and more focused on the implementation of common norms, especially in areas related to cross-border trade, to transnational issues, and to new domains, such as gender equality and environment, new domains in terms of public policy. Second, the development of the European welfare state in the 1970s had been difficult, but not yet because of the neoliberal threat. Rather, its limitations were both structural, so the economic crisis, the belated move of left-wing actors to the European arena, etc., and also cyclical, so with the oil shocks. So, in my opinion, the neoliberal challenge came later. So at the national level from 1979 onwards with Thatcher, and at the European level in the mid-1980s, first with competition policy, which mixed ordoliberalism with what we can call Anglo-Saxon neoliberalism, and then with other European policies. And third, the last point, to link those debates with the current debates, ambitious projects of European welfare state were devised in the 1970s. Most of them were unimplemented, such as the Common European Stimulus or the Redling Directive to control multinationals. But those projects are not forgotten. They form a toolbox that can be used later on to some extent. For example, the recent COVID-19 crisis forced the EU to step up its game in terms of macroeconomic coordination and to some extent in terms of redistribution too. Thank you. That's all. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Laurent. I now turn things over to Lauren Stokes, who's going to present on the market-conforming family migration, the grandmother solution, and the West German welfare state. Lauren?
Great. Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. Yes, thank you so much. In terms of a transition from an in-person conference to a virtual conference, this is the smoothest one I've been a part of so far. So really thank you so much to the organizers. And I appreciate being able to take part with people from all over the globe. So I really want to talk today about childcare. Perhaps a concern many of us have. So in 1964, the West German state sends around a survey to mayors of West German cities, and they say, what are the problems that your city is experiencing related to guest worker recruitment? Every single mayor in that survey mentioned a problem that has received virtually no attention in the historiography: childcare. We've recruited foreign women from Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, Yugoslavia, and Turkey. These foreign women have brought their children with them, and we don't want to take care of them, and we don't know who's going to do it. So this kind of opens up childcare as a field of contestation for the West German welfare state in dealing with migration. And a lot of these foreigners have a pretty time-tested idea about how to take care of the children. They start protesting, they start sending in petitions, and they start bringing in their own parents, the grandparents of the children in question, on tourist visas to take care of the children. And they kind of say, this is the grandmother solution to childcare. We should be able to make use of it. And what I found really interesting in kind of tracing the path of that solution through the bureaucracy is that it runs up against a West German bureaucracy that is absolutely convinced that the West German welfare state no longer really needs the family, and that Southern Europeans have this pathological dependence on the family. So West Berlin, in particular, has a lot of female guest workers. And so it has a lot of female guest workers who bring their own mothers to look after their children while they're working full time. And West Berlin in 1970 kind of announces, we had this great idea. We've decided to accept the foreigners' different definition of the family and allowed them to bring in grandmothers on 9-month visas. This is debated. But what I found so interesting about this was this idea that a grandmother was somehow a different definition of a family, that like German women didn't know grandmothers, that they'd never met them. And the bureaucracy seems unaware of this. But in fact, of German women who worked full time, over half of them used their own mothers to look after their children while they were at work. So the grandmother solution never gets implemented nationally. Some cities clearly extend grandmothers' visas pretty liberally. Some cities do not extend grandmothers' visas very liberally. Many of the cities that don't give grandmothers visas very willingly justify this with the idea that there's something weird about using your grandmother to take care of your children, and that this is kind of due to what is called either a Mediterranean or a Southern European pathology, that they're still dependent on the family. We here in West Germany and Northern Europe no longer are. And Stuttgart is particularly anti-grandmother. And so there's several court cases that I've traced through the Stuttgart system. And one of these finally reaches kind of the highest court in May 1973. So before the oil shock, before the end of labor recruitment in West Germany and across most of the Western Europe. And in this particular case, there's a Spanish woman. She came to West Germany in 1961. She marries a fellow Spanish guest worker in 1965. They have 3 children. In 1968, she tries to bring her mother with her and get her mother a visa, a long-term residence permit, in order to look after the children so she can keep working in her full-time job while her husband also works in her full-time job. This is obviously appealed all the way up to get to the top court. But what I found really fascinating about the case when it got to the top court was the fact that the court ruled in her favor. The court said, you can have your grandmother with you. We're going to give the residence permit to the grandmother. And we're going to do this because the West German Basic Law, effectively the Constitution, states that marriage and the family enjoy the special protection of the state. And so for the court, it explains very clearly that this means that the state needs to make sure that the family is a self-sufficient unit that can take care of its own tasks. And it lays out in great detail the fact that the grandmother's entrance is not justified by her dependency. And this really surprised me, I should say. The existing literature I had read on extended family migration suggested that in Britain and France, grandparent migration is mostly justified by there's no one else who can care for the grandparent. But in the West German 1973 court decision, it is entirely, if the grandmother comes, the kids won't need to go to kindergarten. Great. We don't want to pay for another kindergarten classroom. The kids won't need to go to hospital. And the mother can keep working full time, which is great because we know that she's going to keep working full time because she bought an apartment in Madrid and she's in a lot of debt to the apartment in Madrid. So we don't expect her to go anywhere. So they actually say in this decision, we're letting the grandmother in because we believe if the grandmother is here, you're more likely to reach your savings goals earlier and leave Germany earlier, right? Like the grandmother allows you to be this little space capsule, your little own welfare state within the West German state that can be transplanted just as easily. So I found this a really mind-expanding court case when I first read it, because nothing had led me to expect that this was going to be the justification for family migration in West Germany, the kind of fantasy that a family could be its own welfare state. But as my reading of the case suggests, it's very based on a specific imagining of the welfare state. So over the next 10 years, after the oil shock, as unemployment is going up, as West Germany is beginning to realize that people aren't necessarily going home anytime soon, the grandmother becomes a much more threatening figure. And by 1983, the state is actually considering a blanket ban on grandparent entry, even of German citizens, because the problem with grandparents is they don't speak German, and so they'll teach the children Spanish or Turkish, and then the children will grow up and be ticking time bombs for the welfare state. So in both cases, right, grandmother yes or grandmother no, In both cases, it is entirely about fantasy, this kind of narrative about the family's relationship to the welfare state and what the welfare state is going to do. And the grandmother precedent also proves extraordinarily difficult to use if you are not a healthy older woman who is the grandparent to who is the mother of two full-time working adults. So for instance, in 1983, and I talk about this in the think piece, another grandmother brings her case in front of the same court, but in her case, her daughter is working full-time and her son is unemployed. And so the court says, make the son look after the children. And this is a particularly shocking ruling because the particular place where this guy was not working had for the previous 5 to 8 years had a practice of deporting any man who claimed he was doing childcare, because it was well known that men didn't really do childcare. And so if a man claims he's doing childcare, he's clearly doing something much more nefarious that is not taking care of children. Some of the possibilities were he has tuberculosis and he claims he's doing childcare, he's working illegally and he claims he's doing childcare, or he's a drug dealer and he's claiming he's doing childcare. So they've had for years a policy of saying men don't do childcare. But then, if you can do childcare and not make us have another grandmother in here, at this moment you can do it. So I kind of see this as the grandmother precedent being what I call market-conforming precedent, right? The family has to organize itself in the way that is most congenial to the labor market. I'm very comfortable with the term market-conforming because I'm taking it from foundational economic ideals of the West German state. I take it from Ludwig Erhard, chancellor and first economics minister, often held responsible for the West German economic miracle. Is it more than market conforming? Is this in fact an ordoliberal or a neoliberal principle about using the family to make the state not have to take on costs? That's a question I am not resolved with in my own mind. I got the reader reports on my book manuscript a few weeks ago, and they were also not resolved on what term I could use beyond market conforming. So I'd be curious to hear all of your thoughts. But I think that this kind of story goes back to this question that Chelsea raised and that people raised yesterday about what are the narratives we tell. So the West German state was so committed to a narrative whereby it had freed itself from using families for welfare, but Southern Europe had not freed itself from using families for welfare, that it was constantly in this moment of disavowal, right? It was constantly describing people like grandmothers and aunts as signs of kind of pathology, rather than realizing that probably a lot of West German families also had aunts and grandmothers. The difference is that they didn't come into the purview because they both lived in the same town and didn't require visas to make use of each other's care. I also wonder whether we might kind of use this story to jump into the US welfare state and Melinda Cooper's excellent account of family values and this kind of alliance that she sees between religious conservatives and neoliberals in the US around the family as a provider of welfare. So from what I can see, Catholic social workers and politicians are the most strong advocates of family migration rights in West Germany. And I wonder to what extent they're kind of in correspondence with an ordoliberal idea of the family as a provider of welfare. And I'm still thinking through all of this, so I'm looking forward to talking with all of you, but thank you. There you go.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Finally, I'd like to turn things over to my co-organizer, Giuliana Chamedes, who's going to provide today's commentary on the papers. Giuliana?
Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you to all of you for participating, and to our three panelists for extraordinarily stimulating pieces. So I'm going to provide kind of a brief summary for those who may have joined a little bit later of what I took to be the central claims of the 3 papers, and then I'd like to pose some questions for all of the panelists that I hope will push forward the conversation on today's themes. So I'll start with Chelsea's paper. So through her analysis of the Netherlands in the 1970s and 1980s, Chelsea Schields is strongly encouraging us to look at the interrelationship between migration, racism, and the rise of social scientists as policy advisors in our search for an explanation as to why the Dutch welfare state retrenched in the late 1980s and early to mid 1990s. She especially highlights in the story of that retrenchment the ways in which programs for immigrant welfare were terminated and vulnerable categories like single working mothers were severed from state benefits. At the same time, Chelsea really importantly shows that this retrenchment did not go uncontested, and she lifts up the agency of Surinamese and Antillean activists in the Netherlands. I don't know what's causing that. Oh, here, let me take care of that. Sorry, everyone. She lifts up the agency of activists from the Caribbean in pushing back as they specifically denounced Dutch, but also transatlantic racism and protested the lopsided social scientific efforts to scrutinize the intimate and supposedly aberrant sexual lifestyles of non-white immigrants on Dutch soil. And she uses these stories to draw out a causal explanation for the fall of the welfare state and the kind of reaction that ensued. I'll turn next to Laurent because I think there are the most kind of parallels and conversations happening between these 2 papers first, and then I'll close with Warlouzet. So Laurent Stokes shifts our attention to West Germany in the 1960s and 1970s, and it's really interesting how many parallels there are to Chelsea's story. Her focus is on how West Germany worked to protect state-funded childcare for native-born German children and diminish the amount of state assistance provided to the children of immigrants and guest workers. In the process, she sheds light on what she was just talking about, the grandmother solution, the decision on the part of many local German governments to issue somewhat longer-term visas to grandmothers so that they could care for grandchildren rather than having the German state do so. As in Chelsea's story, one justification offered for this move was that migrant families were somehow different from Western ones, and therefore that they themselves would be happier with a solution of this sort that effectively freed the state from any responsibility towards these children. So in big picture terms, Stokes and Schields converge on an idea that we also started discussing yesterday, which is the rise of a doctrine of private responsibility or self-help as a doctrine that started displacing an older conception of state responsibility over public health, preschool care, and more. And furthermore, they make the claim that this doctrine's very emergence was intimately bound up with Western fears that migrants on European soil would abuse or overburden pre-existing welfare states. So I'm very curious to see how our conversation around this very interesting, provocative point goes today and in the following days. Moving now to Laurent Warlouzet's paper, Warlouzet brings our attention to the institutional story of the European Economic Community. And he argues that in response to 1968, the EEC, which had previously been conceived in rather narrow terms as an institution for the promotion of free trade, was pushed to expand its mission, and become an agent for the promotion of a range of policies, from modest forms of wealth redistribution at the regional level within Europe to gender equity and certain forms of environmental protection. He also paints a very mixed picture in which the European community and ultimately the EU would become this sort of hybrid creature which displayed simultaneously socially oriented policies, neo-mercantilist ones, and market-oriented policies. Ultimately, he does agree with many other scholars who have been charting for years the rise of neoliberalism in Europe, but he sees neoliberal momentum as threatening the project of a European welfare state considerably later than many other scholars chart that. He puts that as a story that really starts in the mid-1980s and 1990s. So to kick off the conversation and wrap up my comments, I'd love to ask all three panelists to elaborate on three issues. First, the question of periodization. Second, the apparently rather narrow question of definitions, specifically the definition of the welfare state. And third, the question of who shapes history and how. So how we select our historical actors and actresses and what sort of causal power we attribute to them. So regarding the first question of periodization, this question is really simple, but I'd love to just have all three of the panelists provide their answer to what they see as a pivotal moment in the history of state welfarism in Europe. A second key point that I'd love to hear everybody reflect on, sorry, crying baby, is the extent to which the panelists see the welfare state itself as a fundamentally progressive or conservative institution. So we have, myriad studies on how to define and understand the origins of the welfare state. And some of those studies really emphasize the origins of state welfarism in Bonapartist or Bismarckian terms as a project which from its inception was seeking to, by the acquiescence of lower working classes, by essentially separating certain categories of society as worthy of protection and others as unworthy. So I'm curious to hear all of the three panelists reflect on basically how they see the welfare state itself before we even start talking about its dismantling. And then finally, third question, who shapes history and how? I'd be curious to just have the three panelists reflect on how they chose their key historical actors and actresses, and on what kind of role you see your key figures as playing in the story of European state welfarism. So if you could kind of give us, a condensed vision of the causal story that you see yourself as telling in your scholarship, I think that could be really terrific in jumpstarting our conversation. Okay, with that, I'll hand things over to the panelists. Thank you so much.
I can say two things if the others want to think. So two thoughts. One about what is the welfare state. I think something about West German history is that in the period when it was West Germany, the most obvious counterpoint is East Germany, right? And so West German bureaucrats are constantly saying, like, well, we have mothers at the home, and they're in East Germany, they make women go to work, and they have a communist welfare state with all of its overweening and totalitarian implications. And so one thing that has been interesting about looking at the welfare state, kind of looking not east, but west and south, has been to see how it appears different just when you look in that direction. But I'll make that point. Kind of the overarching narrative of German history is so based on this capitalist communist fight in the post-45 period that looking at it in a Western perspective has actually shifted my thoughts. Second thought about periodization and maybe also who shapes history. In the years I've been working on this project, I've always said, I work on family migration to Germany. And people always say, oh, so you look at the problems that Turks create for the welfare state. And I say, everyone creates problems for the welfare state. Great news. And what I was actually shocked to find, because of the ideas I came in with, is that it's really not until the mid-1980s that Turk or Islam even appears as a welfare state category. You really see Mediterranean and Southern as the problem categories starting in the late 50s all the way to the mid 80s. And so I think that does also shift our periodization, simply in terms of maybe embedding it in a longer history of how do Germans look at Southern Europe? How do Germans look at the Mediterranean? A history that continues today in various ways that I'm sure we can all fill in for ourselves. And so in particular, there's a kind of, and I haven't traced the intellectual citation practices necessarily as much as I should, but there is a practice of German intellectuals picking up on kind of Italian North-South stories and kind of picking up on the social science that Northern Italian intellectuals write about Southern Italy and saying, oh, well, Southern Italy, and kind of the Mezzogiorno just becomes everything south of the Alps, right, for a certain kind of German social scientist. And so that is an interesting story about periodization, simply because it says, this isn't actually a story about Islam. This is a story about Islam actually stepping into a longer history of internal European stories. Yeah, it was interesting to kind of be in this conference about the global South, and I realized, like, my actors are just starting looking at Southern Europe, and then they kind of turn the whole world into their Southern Europe in some ways in the 80s and 90s. So, thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick up. Thanks for those excellent questions, Giuliana. I think as far as state as either a kind of progressive or conservative formation, I guess I would say it's both in the Netherlands, and it certainly takes on this progressive bent when it's no longer there, that people really yearn for its progressive potential once it's dissolved. But I think it's the inception of the Dutch welfare state in 65 occurs rather late. It's spearheaded by the Labour government. And it was really at its core a kind of conservative effort to retain the value of the nuclear family by providing the presumably male breadwinner with a basic income in the case of unemployment. What it did, however, was not that. 6 years later, divorce laws were relaxed, and it turns out that women wanted to leave relationships that were based on economic dependence. So it had this paradoxical effect of kind of producing a liberalization, a so-called liberalization of household norms. All the while, though, this was attended by really punitive measures and invasive measures whenever women would appeal to the welfare state. Neighbors could actually make complaints to the Ministry of Social Work about fraudulent claims. So social workers could go into homes and count the number of toothbrushes that they saw. They could look for male shirts hanging on clotheslines. So those strike me as really conservative and kind of reactionary manifestations of a welfarist regime. At the same time, though, these material supports were extremely consequential for the people who relied on them, and especially people, Dutch citizens coming from the Caribbean, who were struggling to get Dutch language acquisition, were struggling to find employment like many other people were in the Netherlands at that time. And so one question that I think it was Sam Moyne who raised the scholarship of Jordana Bailkin yesterday. One question that she raises is, you know, we tend to think of colonial states, for example, as being uniquely supported by taxonomies. Like colonial states cannot do their work without this rigorous gradation of people and slotting people into categories. And she's asking, looking at these twin developments of decolonization and the growth of the European welfare state, you know, how different is the welfare state than the colonial state? Because it also needs these categories to administer itself. And this was certainly the case. This is why I turned to social scientists, because this was one of the reasons why the Dutch state turned to social scientists, was to make sense of the Caribbean family and to put it into terms and categories that could be legible to social workers and to those administering the Dutch welfare state.
Thanks, Chelsea. Laurent, do you want to maybe take the mic? Laurent, your mic is still muted, I'm afraid. We can't hear you. Let me see. Maybe try one more time. No. Unfortunately, we can't hear you. Okay. So, Matthew, maybe you can jump in and we can open up the conversation with everyone else.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, we're going to have questions and answers. If you can message me, Matthew Sohm, privately that you want to get into the queue for questions, please do so. Right now, we have a first question from Sara Lorenzini. Sara? And please unmute and turn on your video before you introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, okay, great. First of all, I have to introduce myself. I'm Sara Lorenzini. I teach international history at the University of Trento, the School of International Studies at the University of Trento, and I'm a Jean Monnet professor. So what I will talk about and for the European communities of this story. And therefore, my question is for Laurent. I will ask the question in any case. I hope he will be able to activate his mic later on and answer the question too. Well, thanks. First of all, thanks to the organizers for inviting me for this conference. It is really electrifying, I'd say. It's really a great opportunity to talk about a concept, Europe has been a kind of the prototype of the welfare state, and the failures of the welfare state is a really challenging topic today. I was also especially struck by this idea of the demise of European political hegemony, which is the topic of Giuliana's book, and I'm really looking forward to hear more about that. In the 1970s, there was, I believe, an attempt to recover, really, after decolonization, this political hegemony, stressing European exceptionalism, as it was called back then. Probably most of you are familiar with François Duchesne, who came up in 1972 with this idea of Europe as a civilian power, this idea of normative Europe, exporting social justice, a new attention to the poor, and a new social dimension that later also became exporting democracy and exporting human rights. I mean, later in the late 1970s, 1980s. And this claim, and Laurent's paper deals with it, had actually some success, well, actually great success in the mid-1970s around the Lomé Convention 1975, and in this popularization of Europe as the best friend of the third world that was resonating with the new international economic order and the requests of the new international economic order. So then I come to my question. In the 1980s, and especially after the second enlargement, so goes historiography at least, Europe became increasingly inward-looking. And I would like, so my question to Laurent is, how do you think that this kind of a traditional view of historiography seen in the successive enlargements, the Mediterranean enlargement in the 1980s, and then eventually the final biggest enlargement after the end of the Cold War, how do you think that this plays with the picture that you gave in your paper? Do you think that this success of the European community, then European Union, in admitting new members ultimately weakened the essence of the welfare state per se? Do you think that this is kind of an interpretation that is working, or do you think that actually there were other reasons that more kind of in the mindset behind that developed in the neoliberal mindset that developed in the 1980s? Thank you.
Can I answer? Can you hear me, by the way?
Please answer.
Okay, great. So I try to wrap it up. About Sarah's question, which is linked to the question of periodization that Giuliana raised. So in my case studies, the pivotal moment was 1979 to some extent, because the second oil shock closed some doors and weakened decisively the most ambitious project of European welfare state, even though some of them continued. And the role of enlargement in weakening the welfare state. So the question of Sarah is really hard to gauge, because on the one hand, enlargement reinforced redistributive policies. So cohesion policy were strengthened in the late 1980s due to the Southern enlargements, and then in the 1990s due to the Central and Eastern European enlargement. But on the other hand, there was this narrative about the fact that the larger the market becomes, the more difficult it is to build an ambitious welfare state. So I don't have a definitive answer, but at least in the short term, in the late 1980s, the Spanish and Portuguese enlargement were not seen as opportunities to weaken the European social state. The most problematic actor was Thatcher, and her allies in other countries such as the Netherlands. Then let me pick up Giuliana's question about the definition of the welfare state, because in my illuminating was this project of setting up a European welfare state progressive or conservative. So from many, let's say, moderate left-wing actors, it was progressive, but for left-wing socialists, for the communists, it was not. It was a conservative project. They didn't want to take part in social Europe, because for them it was sort of a collaboration with the capitalist class. So the French Communist Party, but also part of the British Labour, part of the British trade unions did not support this idea of building a social Europe in the 1970s. The British trade unionists saw, for example, the Redling Directive as an attempt to increase the collaboration between the workers and the capitalists. So that's really hindered the project of social Europe. That's really divided the social movement into. It was really a key point. And then your last question about who shapes history, how do we select the actors? As you said, my book is deals with institutional history, so I'm interested in the decision-making process. So I'm studying European institutions, and in so doing, I use archives from national, international, and transnational actors, because I think that it's a bit futile to divide between those three strands. So my book is complementary to other studies of intellectual history, such as those of Queen, a book with a more global outlook, such as Giuliano Garavini's studies and others. So, and also I should have mentioned that my three national case studies were France, Germany, and Britain, for scientific reason, but also for practical reason. I mean, it's impossible to study all actors, all trade unionists, all I don't know, all government, all business organizations over 15 years. So that's all I can say for now.
Thank you. Unless the other presenters want to weigh in, I'll move to the next question. Okay. Next up in the queue is Charles Mayer.
These are very stimulating papers. And my question, I guess, is it's sort of a general question. I worry about, I mean, these are all right to focus on the 70s. And I think Laurent's notion that the notion that the crackdown comes later is revealing. But the long term, it seems to me, is important. What the long-term history of the welfare state, I think, indicates is that one, it's governed so by unintended consequences, that every social policy introduced will have unintended consequences. Susan Peterson's book on the welfare in the 1920s in France and Britain showed that in fact, the very conservative Catholics provisions in France empowered women more than the male head of household policy that the British trade unions passed for. And so we're going to constantly have a different perspective depending upon which group we thematize as inside or outside. And that I think is that I think should really replace the question of, is this progressive or conservative, which Giuliana posed, because it is both, as Professor Schields said, but it is also, it's both because we're always going to judge it differently, I think. So I would just say all states categorize, all states have to denominate and find categories. That's the lesson of James Scott, in part, not just colonial states, I think, and we're all doing it. And the one question I would like to leave, I guess it's Chelsea, not Chelsea, the grandmother, Lawrence, is, and it makes me think, when I've dealt with, over many years, listening to women trying to find their role, and generally, upper class bourgeois women, the question of school closing and school hours is such an important component of family provisioning. Does this get any reflection in these debates on the welfare state? I mean, where women have to take care of kids when schools close. In Germany, they close early. In France, they're closed one on a weekday. And so just if any of this is reflected in terms of these debates. So thank you for the papers.
Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you for that question. It does get some play, and I think there's actually, yes, as you say, in Germany, schools are half day in general. And of course, one of the reasons that West Germany ends up recruiting so many female guest workers is because they do this cost benefit analysis, and they say we'd have to invest a lot more in school provisioning and kindergarten provisioning if we were going to recruit more German mothers, West German mothers, into the workforce. So this is one of the reasons that the recruitment of foreign women is so, in fact, high in the West German welfare state. And I have various pieces of evidence to show that. And then the curious thing there then, of course, is just that then these women get here and they bring their kids. And I have a lot of individual examples of Spanish women, Greek women, Italian women, Turkish women actually saying, can we have all-day school? So one of my favorite examples is a group of Spanish families who decide that they're going to do a sit-in strike at the local Catholic church. They go in during the German language mass and they sit there for 3 days. because they would like the school in their town to have more longer hours so that the Spanish women who are mostly working in the local canning, in this case, factory, don't have to worry about their kids while they're at work. And that particular strike is successful. I think one of the interesting things about categorization is that one of the things that categorization does, I know in my case, and I imagine Chelsea might say this in her case as well, is that it functions to depoliticize. So of course, you could have looked at those Spanish women going on strike for a longer school day and said, oh, this is a problem that's shared by German women and Spanish women and all women with children in this national space. But that wasn't what happened, of course. The local officials kind of said, well, it's Spanish women do that, right? They didn't the category prevented it from becoming a larger area of political contestation. And I think that that's an interesting thing that these racialized categories work. I think that's an interesting work that racialized categories perform within welfare states. Like what demands become properly political and subject to contestation, and what demands become not political or not heard as things up for contestation. And yeah, there is actually an article that argues that the reason that some places in Germany have all-day school now, and those tend to correlate fairly closely with where there are high percentages of foreigners in the population. And I can say more about that, but school provisioning, I'm in favor of it.
Can I say a few words about unintended consequences?
Yes, of course. And then Laurent, say a few words about that, please. And then if Chelsea wants to address the portion of the question directed at her after that, that would be great.
Okay, just a few words to say that Paul Pearson showed that unintended consequences are very important at the European arena, because it's more difficult for national actors to control very well the decision-making process. And for example, in terms of gender equality, so I have my little daughter, we are talking about childcare. So in terms of gender equality, for example, the provision on gender equality were inserted in the Treaty of Rome in 1957 by the French for economic purposes, because they thought that the wage of French workers was higher than the wage of the other female workers in the EEC, because supposedly the French welfare state was stronger. And then when they realized that it was not the case in the 1960s, they simply lose their interest in gender equality provisions. And then a Belgian lawyer who was interested in promoting gender equality for, let's say, social purposes, took on those same provisions and developed a case law at the European Court of Justice that built a whole new field of public policy on gender equality, whereas it was not the purpose of the Treaty of Rome original provision 1957. And we can say the same for environmental policy that was not foreseen at all in the Treaty of Rome in 1957. So
Yeah, thank you, Lauren, for raising this point about categorization functioning to depoliticize, and I think that's absolutely true in the Dutch case. So returning to Giuliana's question about how do we choose our historical actors, I think, although you maybe didn't hear too much of it in this talk or in the version of the paper, but the larger chapter from which it's drawn does a lot more with the activism of people coming from the Caribbean to the Netherlands. And I've received the question in other forums, why aren't you turning to the women who were perhaps trying to seek welfare, and what were their needs and lives? And the reason that I'm focusing on the activism and the social science is because these were actually the political demands that women and Caribbean families seeking redress through the welfare state were trying to make. They were trying to speak the language of the state with its obsession with social science, to make demands and to make an argument for extending the welfare state, and in that process actually redefining what it meant to be Dutch, so that you could see the formative contributions of the Caribbean not only to European wealth, but also just the fact that someone can be simultaneously Caribbean and Dutch. And so they try quite literally to seize the means of knowledge production in order to show that just like uncoupled white mothers, whose numbers were increasing in the Netherlands at the very same time that the sexual revolution undid assumptions about traditional families in Europe itself. They try to show that Black women coming to the Netherlands also had deep interiority and complex reasons for pursuing uncoupled motherhood. And this was, I'm thinking now of the work of Roderick Ferguson, a prominent queer of color critique theorist, who says that, you know, the sociologization of sexuality constantly ascribed the truth of sexuality for Black and racialized others to exterior factors like neighborhood arrangements, household forms, gender formations. And there's no kind of interiority afforded for people like single mothers, Black single mothers. And so what these scholars and activists tried to do in partnering with social scientists was to say that there was not only kind of rich life worlds for the people who were being reduced and essentialized by the dominant knowledge structures of the Dutch welfare state, but that in fact, for all of these historical reasons that connected to the Caribbean to Europe, that the welfare state should be expanded to include those at the margins whose historical exploitation had provided its wealth.
Thank you, everybody. We have a question next from Quinn Slobodian.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. Really, really great papers. I have one specific question for Laurent and then a kind of a meta question for the panelists. The specific question for Laurent is about the European Development Fund. Where do you see that in your story of the European Economic Community having or not having a welfare state function? Of course, that was in the treaty 1957, and neo-mercantilism was part of the European project long before Lomé. So do you see this sort of relationship to overseas territories in the frame when you talk about welfare state or not? Then the meta question is about periodization. It seems to be kind of the operating premise of this workshop that the 1970s were a kind of a hinge point for the first attack on the welfare state in Europe. And so far, I'm not totally convinced of that. I mean, it seems to me that the 1990s are really the time when the sort of ideological foundations of the welfare state get challenged most seriously and effectively. And in that sense, it's also kind of a question for Laurent too, because it seems to me that the debate about the social charter and the social chapter in the Maastricht Treaty, which is then, you know, very importantly opted out of by Great Britain, becomes a kind of a battlefield for social Europe or no. And I wonder if it isn't a bit false to sort of narrativize the debate about the European welfare state as if it rises and falls by the time of Maastricht, when in a way Maastricht really kicks it off. So I wonder, my question would be for the panelists, do you see in your own work the 70s as a kind of roots of the attack on the welfare state, actual attack on the welfare state, or would you place the timeline a bit differently?
So can I start?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. Right, thanks, Quinn, for the questions. So I'm sorry, it's dinner time in Europe, so my little daughter is having dinner right close to the room where I am. But anyway, so you're right, Quinn. There was this European Development Fund. So in the EEC, to explain it clearly, the EEC was founded in 1957 around free market rules mainly, but there was also an agreement to associate the 6 countries of the EEC with the former French and Belgian colonies in a free trade area between Europe, the EEC, and Africa mainly. And there was a small European development fund to fund development projects in Africa. So it can be, again, this comes back to Giuliana's question about whether the welfare state was progressive or conservative, because it can be seen as helping poor African countries to set up development projects. In which all 6 countries were involved. There are, for example, there is a really interesting book by Martin Rempe on how German companies took on the opportunity of the European Development Fund to penetrate the market of former French colonies. But on the other hand, you can argue that it's a matter of it's a neo-colonialist project. But then in the 1970s, it evolved because in the Lomé Agreement, there is this STABEX fund. I mentioned it in my paper. The STABEX is an international fund designed to stabilize the export earnings of basic products of the poorest country, and this can be seen as a direct response to the new international economic order demand for fair international free trade rules. And also in the Lomé Convention, the 1975 Lomé Convention. So this was a new agreement between the EEC and former French, Belgian, and British colonies of Africa and the Caribbean. Also in the Lomé Agreement, there was inverted trade preferences, meaning that the associated countries had enjoyed free access to the European market, but the reverse was not true anymore. So in theory, that was very generous, but in practice, well, those associated countries could not export a lot of industrialized high value goods to Europe anyway. So it's difficult to assess to what extent it was really a big concession. But there is this kind of mixture between neo-mercantilist and socially oriented vision in the Lomé Agreement, probably more in the Lomé Agreement, the 1975 Lomé Agreement, than in the Yaoundé Agreement. And also all of this took place before 1979. Again, 1979, 1980, then you have the decision by Reagan to stop the aid to stop the North-South dialogue. There you have the debt crisis of southern country in the 1980s. So the 1970s were a much better environment to talk about developing ambitious North-South project. But Giuliana will probably talk a little bit more about that later on.
So perhaps Quinn is picking up on the fact that I've conspicuously not addressed Giuliana's question about periodization. I find this question a bit tricky. I mean, the standard narrative of the Dutch welfare state is that in the 70s, it's realized that there's a major problem, that 13% of the workforce is on disability, and social spending is like a third of national expenditures, and that's no longer tenable in the aftermath of the 73 oil embargo, at the same time that labor is becoming much more expensive. But that the solutions to those problems were sought in the 80s through cuts, not dissolution of welfare, just cuts to wages that could create new jobs. Most jobs were part-time work. Most of those jobs are still occupied by women. I think even today, 70% of part-time labor is female in the Netherlands, very strikingly. And then in the 90s is when you see the true privatization, key industries, telecom, housing, all become privatized in that time period. And the centerpiece legislation of the welfare state gets kind of cut and then recasted as a new law called the Work and Welfare Law. So classic kind of workfare legislation. But if we center the Caribbean in the offshore Caribbean as part of the history of the European welfare state, we see maybe a slightly more complicated picture because, as I was saying at the outset of my talk, I mean, these spaces were always really unevenly integrated into the European welfare state. So to the extent that there was a kind of rise and fall, I mean, if I had to choose a signal moment for the Dutch welfare state, I might actually pick an unconventional year, 1969. because this is a time when the welfare state in Europe seems to be performing very well, and there's broad consensus behind its policies. And in '69, there's a massive uprising on Curacao that draws attention to the inequities of material and economic dimensions, political dimensions throughout this Commonwealth kingdom. It was a moment when people were demanding increased Dutch accountability for the economic affairs of the islands. And it was a moment when things could have been different and worked. And still, in the aftermath of that uprising, we see very familiar reports produced that deliberately obscure the structural origins of inequality and turn once again to the Caribbean household form to explain not only labor unrest, but also poverty. So I would say, you know, maybe if we center Caribbean narratives as these sites of offshore Europe, we don't quite see a welfare state that rises and falls in quite the same way.
Yeah, I'll be super quick because I see we're now well over time, but I tend to agree with Chelsea about, like, it depends on where we're looking from in terms of what was the welfare state even as at its height, whenever that height was. That depends on kind of where we're looking at. So certainly in Germany too, the story is the 90s and early 2000s are the moment of, like, workfare and the moment of various cuts and retrenchments and logics of moral hazard. But if you look at migrant workers, those logics are all present in the 60s already. So how do we understand that? Do we understand that as a migrating logic, or do we understand that as the kind of racialized compact of the welfare state eroding, so that the white working class, the native working class, is also subject to these same logics of surveillance and moral hazard? I don't know quite how to narrativize that story, but I guess the question is, from whose perspective are we telling it? And this maybe also goes to a point that was made yesterday by a few of the panelists in terms of we want to tell a story where neoliberalism is a disruptive break in the welfare state, but a lot of those practices exist beforehand. And I've argued this before, but I don't think any place that has workfare legislation in the 1990s didn't previously try it on foreigners on the national body. I don't know what that means yet, but I think that that's true. I think we'd find that was broadly true. So on that demoralizing note, thank you.
On that demoralizing note, thank you, Laurent. Thank you to all the speakers. I think we're going to have to wrap things up now. We have one question still in stack from Stefan Tetzlaff. So I've asked Stefan if he could write the question in the chat box, and we'll think about it in the next few days. I also wanted to mention that we'll have some extra time at the end of Friday for more informal discussion, socialization. So this will be an opportunity to bring up any sort of pressing questions that you weren't able to get around to, or that we ran out of time for. So apologies for that. And thank you once again to Lauren, Chelsea, Laurent, and to Giuliana. And thank you everyone for attending. We'll see you all again tomorrow, same time, same virtual place, 12 to 1:30. Thank you and bye-bye.